to the Trinity Force Podcast. Yo, it's that Triforce cast beaming straight to your home. Grab a beer so we know Pone ain't drinking alone. Send an email, a quick tweet, just pick up the phone. Leave a message at the beep if you're a creep, watch your tone. Discuss the meta game, patch notes, whatever helps your stats most. Obi-Pone Kenobi is your last hope to snatch gold. So grab your headphones and join in the fun. We'll try and force in some jokes and some cringeworthy puns. Yo, we can make it together, people. Trinity Force Podcast. These boys are second to none. Now that's the end of the intro. It's time we begun.
And there we are, live with episode 466 of the Trinity Force Podcast. Thank you guys for joining us this week. It is a three-man show, as Dom and Skyen are with me. Say hello, both of you.
Hello.
Hey-o.
And with Skyen on the show, that it can only mean one thing. We are talking about a new champion that is coming to the Summoner's Rift in the following weeks. A champion that will be disabled for Worlds, however, will become on a patch that hits before Worlds happens. That is Ornn, the fire below the mountain. He is he's a Freljordian, and
he's a demigod.
More than less. That's actually a really good way to put it. So I guess we're going to be talking about him tonight. Before we get in that, I just want to say, guys, thank you so much again for listening to us. Go check out patreon.com/TForce Network. $10 a month gets you a Champions Like podcast. This month, we are having Echo and Camille. Then those will be out by the 30th. So if you want to grab those, $10 gets you all previous Champions Like podcasts and the Champions Like podcast we put out in the month of August. And then moving in September and whatnot, I'm looking at Gragas, and I think Gragas is the only one I have lined up right now. It's going to be hard with the preseason, but we're going to try our best to get those out there for you. So let's just move right into it and talk about Ornn, the fire below the mountain, who is more than less a demigod and very interesting to talk about. And as always, Skyen, you have the soapbox. So however you want to drive this conversation, go for it.
Yeah, well, Ornn is basically, he's the maker of the world, apparently, in the Runeterran Freljordian mythology. He's really, they've tried to position him as well as Volibear and Anivia.
Anivia was the other one they mentioned, yeah.
Yeah, as very much as shaping forces, as demigods who kind of helped forge the world, make the world. Ornn is said to have made the mountains. Volibear supposedly made the rivers, and I'm sure Anivia is meant to have created the glaciers or something. So that's kind of the vibe that they're going for, this trifecta so far of godlike Freljordian characters. And Ornn's character design is very much, it's kind of an interesting one because it is almost entirely about one feature that he has, and that is his horns. If you look at at the character model, for instance, from the top-down perspective you have in League of Legends, most of what you see on screen when Ornn is there is his horns, and it's the same thing for his splash art, which is very much, it's de-emphasized Ornn's face, Ornn's characteristics, even his outfit and his beard. Everything about him is de-emphasized in favor of the horns and of that glowing left hand with which he forges things. So he's this. It's a weird combination of being a powerful demigod who forges things and is this powerful presence, but also reticent. Like there's really not that much to him. He's not very colorful. He's not super bright. He's got the redness of the forge and the blackness of the soot, I guess, from the forge, and those are sort of his primary design elements. And that fits very much with his. That fits very well with his lore, which is very much about him being reticent. He doesn't really want to put himself forward. He wants to let his work speak for itself. So the idea of not having a too flashy character design to kind of go with that makes sense. And he's also this very boxy, bulky kind of blob, essentially. His shape language is it's just this very square, boxy, rounded thing that moves across the battlefield without too much fanfare. He doesn't have a lot of like hugely over-exaggerated animations or anything. And in that sense, like there's not that much to talk about with him. Like his aesthetic is standard Freljord. There's lots of leather and thick belt buckles and very angular shaped metal going on, but none of it is really prominent with him. So like he's sort of a difficult design to talk about outside of how well he represents the lore he's supposed to show.
The easiest comparable sure seems like Braum.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of thematic similarities, but then even just, they got the big muscular guy, the facial hair thing going on there.
And the lore
unrelated.
connection.
Is it weird that his like puppy dog nose is what stands out to me more than anything else? Like it's kind of
is.
downplayed in the skin in the skin splash, but I look at the model in game and like that's what keeps getting my attention. It's like, oh, this is like that's really interesting. I like that a whole lot more than ways they could have gone, and it makes me really intrigued about this character. Just like that one little thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting with the face. Like, there's elements of like a Schnauzer dog to it, but there's also some walrus-like qualities, I think, in the way it's constructed, and of course the goat, the ram aesthetic that he's got going. He is a bit of a hodgepodge of different animals, which is kind of interesting because Volibear is very much a bear and Anivia is very much a bird, but this guy is kind of sort of a ram, but there's also something vaguely predatory about him. So he's a bit of an odd design, and I think it's because so many of his features are indistinct and de-emphasized that he's kind of hard to place as a design. Like, he could be dog-like in the face, he could be anything. But if you look at his character model, like he has the red and the black, and then everything else is like gray, brown, brown, gray, some variation thereof. So it's like, yeah, he's curious. I have been thinking about him a lot but only in terms of his lore connection, really. Like, that's the thing that's been grabbing me, is exactly how his personality and his lore comes out in the voice lines and the short story. But his design itself is not very eye-catching, and it's not supposed to be, I think.
Right.
You say the voice lines because I was listening to some of those, and literally the first thing I thought was, okay, so they were just trying to turn Ron Swanson from Parks and Rec into a character for League of Legends, to the point where I go back and forth between calling him Ornn Swanson and Ron Swansorn.
Ornn Swanson, I'm gonna steal that.
Yeah, no, feel free. It's everyone's now. So
well,
that was literally the first thing, and then there are a lot of very similar themes going on there between Ron and Ornn.
You made a good point earlier, Skyen, or without maybe realizing it, that he says that he wants to make his work stand out, or he wants his work to speak for itself. That's the line that he uses in his short story. And if the listeners of this podcast haven't read his short story, this is let me back up. We've had Skyen on for well over a year at this point, talking about a ton of different champions that have been released. And just about every single time, we shit on the lore. Pretty hard, right? Like,
yeah.
Just about every single champion that's been on here, we have not been happy with the way the lore has been written. And it's like Warwick and Ivern are the two that come out to be the forefront, where we're like, man, this lore kind of sucks a lot. Ivern being the number one, where his lore is just terrible. It was like an afterthought. But with Ornn, the lore feels like it was the reason the champion was created. Like, they built this champion around the lore, and I would love to see that more in the future. I think we all would, and it's a lot of fun because now when I can play or see this champion, I can think, all right, this is the strong silent type like Rammus, who only says okay, but he has meaning and purpose behind his strong silence because of his thematic of having that shop and having items and upgrading items and making those items speak for himself. So to continue my point from earlier, if you didn't read the lore, read it, because the way the lore is written is that the TLDR he is a demigod more than less, and he decided to create a home for himself. Well, he had a home, the home burned down, he decided to create a new home for himself, and that's when he created the Great Forge. And when he created the Great Forge, he had to run water through it, and that water essentially the mountain cast up all the expenditures from this forge and created a dark winter. And that's how Freljord was started, because he decided to create a forge. And then from there, some generals from the Freljord came to him and said, we need help. And then he created the Howling Abyss. And then he helped create the Murder Bridge. And then he was, overseeing there was just like a troop of blacksmiths, essentially, and showing that, that he was never presented as a demigod. He was just a guy who taught people how to make weapons. And then he got in a fight with Volibear, killed everybody, and then everyone died. And so now his legacy is the items that he created rather than what he did. And all of that, and that's like the very short story version of it, all of that makes me intrigued to see this champion, because he, like you said, he shaped and made the Freljord. He is the reason the Freljord exists. Hell, he made Brahm's shield. They even talk about that in the story.
And there's actually a lot of interesting lore connections. Now, first of all, his lore is very much modeled on Norse mythology, like down to the way, like you really should genuinely read the short stories that were put out for Ornn, because they are very, very good. They really echo of a real mythology, like the kind of thing that Vikings would tell to each other around a campfire kind of thing. It really does have that feel to it, and it is very much based on the structure of mythological stories like that. But the parts that are interesting, perhaps, to people who are sort of interested in what's connected to League of Legends is, first of all, he created Brom's Door, as you said, for a troll who wanted to guard his treasure. But he also had a fork that he used for eating, which he then threw into the sea, where it was taken by some undersea king. And it's heavily implied that that fork he used to eat his spiced cherries is actually Fizz's Trident, yeah. And there's some implication that the shovel that he once created to dig the Howling Abyss was thrown to the Shadow Isles, where it became Yorick's shovel. It's not entirely clear exactly, but there are some implications that a lot of the magical items that exist in the League of Legends universe originated with Ornn.
Which I like that type of thing, if only so that, like, we no longer, oh hey, mystical item just exists and nobody can explain it. At least there is some possibility now that there is something that actually can explain this and everything. I do want to back up and going back to just this idea that it's campfire stories that are being told and sort of passed down from generation to generation. It's like that kind of gives us this unreliable narrator, really, because the storyteller is really just trying to tell the children who have gathered the story that they want to hear. Like, she's trying to craft really interesting and compelling stories for these people, but that doesn't necessarily mean any of it is completely factual or true or anything. This is just stories that have been passed down, and every oral history ends up undergoing a lot of different changes along the way, just as new narrators get involved. And I really liked that. I thought they accomplished that specific goal really, really well with this. I've been a very vocal critic of Riot's storytelling in the past, and I think they did a really, really good job because of the avenue that they went with it.
Yeah, it's also because Ornn is one of the few champions who actually feels like he's really dialed into the League of Legends universe, in the sense that, there's a reason he exists. He has a thematic connection with the region that he's attached to. He has a role in the League of Legends universe, which is creating magical items that other people then run around and use, but he's just the guy who's the origin of those things. Like, it makes me feel a lot better about something like Fizz just having a magical trident because reasons, when I know, okay, probably Ornn maybe forged that thing because of a legend. Like, it gives this sense that the world has a mythology of its own, an understanding of, why do magical items exist? Well, there was a god who made them. Like, and that makes it feel more coherent to me.
I honestly feel like the Riot narrative team is more into the Freljord region than any others, because if you go back and you look at Lissandra and Sejuani and so many of the other characters that are associated with the region, like, they are all written in such a way that it feels like they were always there. I mean, in Ash's original lore, Sejuani had actually been mentioned, and Lissandra, I believe, came up in Sejuani's lore, but it's been a long time since I really looked at it. But all these characters feel like they were always there and part of things going on, and Ornn feels very much the same way. But you look at Xayah and Rakan, for example, and these are new things that just got thrown out. And the same is going to be the case, when you look at Camille. It doesn't feel like Camille had always been there. It doesn't feel like Ivern or Kled had always been there. Talia, Aurelion Sol, I mean, it's really interesting, and I mean that in the actual usage, not the Midwestern usage. It's just really interesting that Freljord is this region that Riot's writers are really so dialed into, and they craft such compelling stories around, when they're actually focused on the region and not like sort of taking a character, whatever Ivern was before he became Ivern, when they're not taking a character out of that region and throwing them somewhere else.
Yeah, I think it's because they have a lot of thematic ground to stand up. Like, Ornn is Norse mythology made flesh. Like, he's really heavily dialed into that thing. Sejuani is all about that kind of Conan the Barbarian warrior bitch kind of.
I just what's the sister's name? I just found it out. Cyrilda.
Avarosa and yeah,
Avarosa, Cyrilda, and Lissandra.
Yeah. And Lysandra has this whole ice witch kind of thing, which is also like there's a whole lot of old stories about ice witches and stuff. Riot are drawing on a lot of pre-existing material when they do Freljord stuff, whereas Piltover, they try very hard to make Piltover and Son and stuff like that much more their own thing, which I think is why it kind of feels a little thinner, because it doesn't really have that subtext of being in reference to other things in the real world. And then also because they really need to do a better and more solid job of world building, but that's a different conversation.
I mean, we have to give credit where it's due and everything. A lot of the narrative team working on it now is working with a lot of stuff that was created long before they got involved.
Yeah.
And so they're just sort of taking pieces that were really just made, because they wanted to make these characters.
Yeah, they're making 6 or 7
trying to work with that. Yeah.
Together, basically.
Yeah.
I'd be happy if Riot just came out and said, hey, here's all this lore. We're going to literally list off every single piece of lore that we want you guys to ignore right now, right? Like,
yeah.
Alistar, for example, because he's got that shitty trash tier lore. Completely ignore that. Yeah, the champion exists. We're gonna roll back around to that champion, but like they just go completely ignore this right now, and then they come back and then maybe they take pieces from it. That'd be fine with me. Like just go, all right. Well, Alistar, yeah, he's a Minotaur, but he didn't run around that maze and whatever. Just we're gonna throw that to the side and we're gonna hit it later. But this is what we're building on, and we're trying to build it back up to make you guys have a better immersive feeling inside a league.
It's interesting that you touch on that, because we get a very different version of Volibear in Ornn's stories than we got through the lore that's written for him. That was one of the things that immediately struck me, or right when I got to that section. It was, this Volibear seems like he's just kind of rage and war driven and everything, and he's just like he's going to do whatever the hell he wants to do. He is interested in conquest and causing trouble just because he feels like it. And the Volibear that we see in his lore is he's more a shrewd, meticulous, thoughtful leader who prides and embraces his warrior background, but that doesn't mean he has like bloodlust or he's searching for war at every opportunity.
Yeah, I think pretty much the Ornn lore acts as this kind of retcon of Volibear entirely. And also Anivia used, she's the Cryo Phoenix, and they kind of tried to rewrite her a little bit to be more of an elemental force in the Freljord. But I think the Ornn update is very much, screw that shit, they're all demigods. Because that's just a much easier way to explain Armor Bear and Frostbird and evil glowing Forge Goat. Well, I think it's a much stronger framework than saying that there is a race of bears that Volibear is the leader of, and there is a special race or kind of birds that Anivia is the leader of, is the greatest of. Because then you don't have to explain why don't we ever see any of the other armored war bears running around.
Like Skarner being the last of the Scorpions.
For example, which is a dumb story.
Right. So So Dom had mentioned that this is a story, and I'm going to tell a little quick story before I get into this, is that when I first started reading Ornn's lore, I messaged Dom, I said, this is really fucking stupid. This reads like a child's book. Why? Why does Riot, there's a bunch of fucking monkeys writing this? And he's like, if I remember correctly, it is a child's story. And I'm like, wait. And I went back and I scrolled up and I completely skipped the italicized text where it was the, I'm presumably old woman or mother type figure telling the story to the children. So it's literally written as a children's story. And then I went, oh, okay, this makes sense. But I said that because, they're retconning Anivia or changing Anivia's lore, however you want to put it, because she becomes like this. Anivia is Ornn's sister through the lore, and Volibear is Ornn's brother.
His brother.
Right. And they make Anivia not a trickster, but Anivia is like, oh, well, I'm going to get back at Ornn because I don't like what he's doing. So she flies in through a window and sets things on fire. Like, it's just not how I would ever picture Anivia to act or behave.
To be fair, Anivia flew in, tickled Ornn's nose, and then Ornn sneezed or something and set the house on fire.
Right, but even that, I'm thinking this gigantic bird flew into this home and tickled his nose to get back at her brother. It just doesn't strike Anivia unless that story, again, and it's vague, that story could have been from when they were very, very young, and Anivia was more of like a teenager or adolescent than she was an adult, as we see now.
Yeah. I mean, and I think it's also because it's a children's story. It's like, haha, the silly creatures having
Right.
the fun times kind of thing, where like maybe the story from Anivia's perspective is that they actually had a huge, great big fight or something. Like there's a lot of ways you can go with that, but I really see Ornn's lore as very much this is the first step of a major retcon of a lot of the Freljord sort of mythological creatures to kind of fit them into something that makes a little more sense.
I mean, and I guess in Anivia's case, you know, they rewrote her lore with the Freljord event back in 2013, and like the Anivia that we have come to know in the game isn't necessarily like the same version of the creature because she's been reborn so many times that she's forgotten so many of her past lives and everything. It's reasonable that her personality and her characteristics might have gone through some type of evolution along the, you know, throughout the eons she's been alive.
Yeah, I'm sure they'll get around to figuring out exactly how they want to write her eventually. But yeah.
Is it weird to anybody else that Anivia isn't a phoenix yet she could be reborn through an egg?
She's a cryo phoenix.
Yeah, it's still kind of weird.
Yeah, I mean it was I think it was just Riot is like, we don't want to make a fire phoenix. We're gonna be clever and make an ice phoenix instead.
Yeah, that not to deter the conversation from Ornn, but I just always thought that was weird. I'm really interested to see how Ornn behaves when it comes to League of Legends, because I like the idea that his art or his weapons speak volumes to his character, and the fact that we can purchase anywhere at any point inside of the game says the same thing about how he acted inside of Freljord, where he wanted his weapons or his creations to have meaning. There was a point in the lore where he makes the Howling Abyss for it's not for Ashe, but for one of the other.
Yeah, for Avarosa and
Avarosa.
the other one and Lysandra.
Cyrilda.
Yeah, it would be Cyrilda.
Right.
He makes the Howling Abyss for her, and he's fine, whatever. He makes the Howling Abyss, but then Lysandra comes and wants him to create the Murder Bridge, and he doesn't like the idea of creating it because he believes that magic will tear it apart, or will make his work not mean as much. And then he sees that it is, it's crumbling. The Murder Bridge is crumbling because of the magic bestowed upon it. And
that was Lysandra's part of her plot to eventually unleash the Watchers and take over the world, or whatever the fuck it is she's trying to do. But yeah, there is that little thing of Ornn sort of being dismissive towards. It's also in his voice lines when he breaks a tower. He's like, "You put magic in it, so of course it's gonna fall down." And there are some interesting voice lines. One of his voice lines is, "I taught Doran everything he knows." We now have an explanation for the Doran's items.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me that they would take this, amazing blacksmith and have him shit on everybody who's making any of the items in League, because he's strengthening all the items presumably when somebody else can purchase from him. So I'm surprised that he doesn't. I mean, I understand why they didn't do it, but I'm still surprised they didn't create special items that only he would create, rather than, you know what I mean?
Well, they did with the special upgrades that you can get when he's on your team.
Right, but he upgrades the items instead of like going, well, I can make Trinity Force better, so he makes his own version of Trinity Force. Like Super Trinity Force, the old joke with like Frozen Mallet and stuff. Which
Frozen Mallet? What would that be? Phantom Dancer and
right,
or now it'd be Nashers, and then
it used to be Phantom Dancer, Frozen Mallet, and what was the last item? Lichbane. That was like super. That was Super Trinity Force. The joke always was, because that's like the major components.
Yeah.
Right. Is there anything to speak toward the way he acts with the troll in the lore, and creating Brahm's shield? Because I don't think that's something that any of us saw coming. That he actually created that door, and then Brahm. Refresh my memory how Brahm gets the door.
He punched the mountain until only the door was left, and then he took the door.
Yeah. He liked the door, so he took the door.
Yeah, well, he couldn't.
But he wasn't trying to steal it. It was just like, oh, this looks good for me, so I will take it.
Right.
He wasn't trying to steal the treasure, though. So
yeah, exactly. That's the clever. I mean, the story of Ornn and the troll very much recalls. There are a few stories in Norse mythology about Loki. And the ways in which he interacts with dwarves who make magical items, and he manages to con them out of those items, manages to steal them. But the story as it goes is that Loki wagers his head that two sets of dwarves can't create better items than each other, and he tries to play them off against each other. And even though he gets away with it, ultimately, because the dwarf, he loses the bet, the dwarf now owns his head but can't touch his neck. So he gets away without having his head cut off, but the dwarf sews his lips shut. Like, so in Norse mythology, there's very much always these stories about someone thinks they fooled someone, but then the other party finds a loophole, which is what the Ornn story is, that the troll managed to trick Ornn into promising to make him an impenetrable door. And then Ornn goes, all right, I'll make you an impenetrable door that you can't get through either. Haha, reversal. And that's a pattern that turns up in Norse mythology all the time, which is part of why I like the lore so much.
You would think that Norse mythology would have a very proud tradition of lawyers and law, not warriors.
Well, I mean, law in Norse mythology is basically either whatever you can enforce with might and blood and fury, or whatever you can get the gods to agree to. And usually you can bribe them. So, it's a little bit nebulous what exactly law is in Norse mythology.
So, with all this said, we now need the lore for what Summoner's Rift is, right?
Oh, yeah.
The completely and totally
they're
changed
getting
lore.
there. I think they're getting there.
Some lore, like some vague lore for it when they did the Summoner's Rift update. I seem to remember some like vague thing that they never followed up on.
Well, I remember seeing tweets of them talking about that basically the lore is no longer canon. The old lore with the people fighting the summoners and summoner spells are just called summoner spells because we're so used to it, and that eventually is going to change and whatnot. So I think we're all impatiently waiting to figure out what is called, and then there's obviously some of us that just don't care. But I wanted to ask you, Skyen, since we went through quite a bit of this, what did you think about, in your opinion, when Riot releases a champion or a skin or something, the community rallies behind it in one way or the other, and the community this time said, we want to see a change. We don't like the way the model looks. Do you, as an artist, as somebody who would release their final product to a crowd, are you okay with that? Do you like the way that happens, that Riot goes back and does that, and maybe, I don't want to call it admit their mistakes, but changes to appease the crowd? Or is, what are your feelings about that whole situation?
In this instance, the initial model that Ornn released with, his horns were very close together as they ran down his back and then curled into horns. But in his splash art, you can see pretty much immediately they diverged like goat's horns. And like ram's horns do. So in the old model, it kind of looked like he had a car tire on his head, which it's sort of, I would say, just didn't really look like the splash art, the concept art that it was presented as. And if the model was supposed to represent the concept art, then yeah, like the feedback is fair that Riot should have changed that. Like as an artist, I'm perfectly happy to change anything if I feel like the feedback is fair. Like if I feel like the thing I put out doesn't accomplish what I wanted to do, then sure. Like it's another thing entirely when it's stuff like, if you remember, when Sivir's new splash art was released, she had like buck teeth. Some people thought like she had they complained a lot. Oh, she has buck teeth in the splash. And then Riot went and changed it. And I was kind of like, why? That's not a flaw. That's not a mistake. And it's the same thing with Katarina. When her splash art was updated, everyone was like, oh, but she doesn't look like an anime girl anymore. And then they went back and changed it. It's like, there wasn't really a flaw. That was just kind of a preference that people had, that it should be prettier. And it's the same thing, the most recent thing I got upset about was Heartseeker Lucian, where his initial splash had him have this very not really handsome, kind of very peculiar, curious face, where I thought, oh, that's actually really interesting. Like as Casanova, who isn't traditionally handsome, but who gets by on his charm, that's a really fun concept. And oh, wait a minute, they changed it and made him a pretty boy instead. Like that kind of thing, I feel like Riot shouldn't bow to the pressure to be aesthetically pleasing. But when it's a thing of the splash art and the model don't line up, then one of the two has to give.
Sure.
And in this instance, it was the model.
It's really jarring when the splash art sets one expectation and then the in-game model looks like something else.
Sivir is a really good one for that, Dom. The Huntress Sivir.
The old Professor Rise skin is one that always stands out with me because I thought that splash art was really, really good, and then the model didn't look anything like that. And a lot of it was really just color stuff that was going on, but it was still like, oh, I love this splash art, and that's why I want to run this skin. And then I'm stuck staring at a model I'm not interested in. After Trundle got reworked, when his little slugger Trundle when the splash art didn't get upgraded at the same time, it looked totally different, and it was just like these two totally different things. And so you're staring at a loading screen, and you have this expectation set for you, and then when it doesn't look like that, it's really, really disappointing from a user standpoint.
Yeah. I was just mentioning the Huntress Sivir one because that one, I think they use like the Chinese art or something with that, but it looks like it's coming out of a comic book rather than the traditional splash painting
and
style.
I believe that's why Riot has started doing a thing where they update all the splashes when they do a visual upgrade for a champion, because otherwise you have this situation like Dom said, where you have an advertisement for the thing, which is the splash art, which is supposed to tell you how this thing looks, and then you get into game and it looks different. You can kind of get into like ethics in games kind of thing. I don't want to, but where is that false advertising for the thing? Like, so there is I say once there is a clear and present mismatch between the splash art and the model, then you have to change one or the other. But if it's just a thing of, oh, this vaguely looks not pretty enough or up to my aesthetic standards, then it's like, you can take it or leave it. Like, if the artists at Riot agree that something has to change, then fair enough to them. But if they say no, it's not like, if it's not a major, like an actual issue of something not looking like something.
Right. No, I agree that his horns looked like an old car tire previously. Hell, I even saw the update, and I was reading the thread the first time, and people were complaining about the update. Oh, I like the old one better. This one doesn't.
That's always going to happen.
I realize I can't please everybody, but you know, it is what it is. Hey, one last thing. I mean, it doesn't have to be the last thing, but in his splash art here, you can see it on the screen. Why is there a bird on his horns around a gigantic inferno? Wouldn't that bird not be able to perch on his horns, especially in a bird from Failure?
It should be a dead bird. I think it's either a little joke by the artist, or it's supposed to show that he's a gentle soul. Birds are often used for that. If you think of Bastion in Overwatch, like the bird perching on his shoulder is very much supposed to, oh, he's so gentle he wouldn't harm a bird. So I think in this splash art, it's supposed to communicate that Ornn is gentle enough that he would not harm a small songbird.
I mean, you could also argue that it's like he's powerful enough that he can quell the heat of the flames around him.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
Oh,
but yeah, small birds have been used to. There are in the Bastille in France. They used to give prisoners songbirds to keep. Especially the most horrifying murderers got little songbirds to keep. That was kind of a tradition that they should have this little songbird to keep. And there's a lot of folklore and stories about terrible creatures having affection for small birds as a way to kind of show, but they're nice, they're pleasant, to kind of humanize them. So I think it's just kind of a callback to that.
Sure.
I hadn't noticed that. That's a nice touch.
That little bird. That's like, Dom, the pug nose sticks out to you. Like some of the things, the bird sticks out to me because it's white. And it's like the only piece that isn't red or brown or green, or not green, red or brown or orange, or black in his splash art. One other thing I want to point out with the splash art that I really liked was that his eyes aren't looking. They made it so specifically his eyes are looking down at the item that he's forging rather than at the screen. And I've noticed a lot of splash arts that they generally have the champion looking. They'll have the champion look at the screen. I think Talia was one of them, if I remember correctly, because she's kind of like gliding and looking at the screen. And I just like the fact that he's they took the time to show that he's always into his work. And I really like this champion. I like the splash art. I'm very pleased with everything that they did with this champion.
Yeah, the interesting thing about, the really interesting thing about the splash art is that Ornn is not really the main feature of it. Like the main color features, the main things that draw the eye are his hand, which is covered in, I guess, molten metal, and the glowing sword on the forge, and then your eyes snap to his glowing eyes and the horns, and you kind of realize that he's there. But like on a first viewing, those are the things that draw the eye. And again, it's the forging hand and the sword that are the that in terms of color priority are the main draw of the picture. So his work is again speaking for itself, which is very. I mean, again, it's a very. I like the coherence between what Ornn's concept is supposed to be and what he looks like in all of his art. It's very well executed.
Now, did I miss it in the lore or the short story? Did they speak to his ram that he has for his ultimate? The fact that he can conjure a ram? Because I think I mentioned that.
It's because when Ornn is first born, he's spoiling for a fight. Like, he just wants to kick the shit out of something. But nothing can really fight him until he tries to fight a mountain. So he starts just fighting the ground and the land. He just kicks the shit out of it. And that's the origin story of why there are mountains in the Freljords, because Ornn literally punched them out of the ground. And then as a reward for having this great fight with the land opens its heart to him. And in his heart, there is a fiery ram who then Ornn can call upon on command.
I don't know how I missed that when I read it. I must have just kind of glazed over that paragraph.
Well, there's a lot going on, and the sort of the simplicity of the format that they took and everything makes it really, really easy to miss, because it's really just like a sentence. It's really easy to skip over that type of thing when you're going through it because there's so much else that you're taking in and everything, which is really cool and adds a lot of layers of nuance to the stories, which seem to be presented in a simplistic format like this. And again, I just like, it makes me feel like they really they hit it. They hit it out of the park with this, with the way they constructed their lore. They did a really, really good job.
Yeah, it is kind of harder to sustain a long conversation about something where you just like everything about it.
I was going to say the
same
same thing.
When you have something upsetting to shout about. Unfortunately, I mean, it's also that Ornn is just not a super. Everything about him is not really that worked up. Like, it's not like Saya and Rakan where they're bright and they're colorful and they're party people and you can get annoyed because they're fucking kissy face millennials and you can get excited because Rakan is hilarious. Ornn is just kind of there and he does his thing and he's okay with not being a party piece.
And I guess the other thing worth mentioning is that we only have the short stories right now, or the campfire stories. We don't have a short or long form traditional lore like we've gotten with a lot of the other champions. That's sort of focused on the champion from their point of view, for lack of a better term. And so maybe we would have a different perspective or a different set of feelings about everything. Would we have that lore? But we don't. So we're working with what we have right now. Yeah. Since he's coming out probably like Thursday, Friday.
Yeah. And I mean, with Riot's pace of putting out lore, I wouldn't hold my breath for getting a lot more Ornn lore or pretty much any lore for a while. I mean, how long did it take them to put out like a comic about Darius?
I'll be interested to see if they do some stuff with like some lore related stuff with the rune system, since they're doing a pretty substantial rework to a lot of that.
Yeah, and the runes are kind of a big deal in Rune Terra with the Rune Wars and Rise collecting runes.
Yeah, I mean, they could really construct a lot of like compelling stuff, especially now that they have a champion like Ornn, sort of on the scene. And it also gives them an opportunity to build up a lot of sort of supporting characters. That's one thing Riot has been really, really bad about along the way is like most of their supporting characters tend to become champions later on down the line, and they're trying to do more and more of that with some of the more recent releases. But historically, like Sejuani got mentioned in Ash's lore way back when and everything, and then hey, lo and behold, she turns into a champion, and then Lysandra later down the line. And it's kind of cool that there's that foreshadowing, but it's also disappointing that we don't ever get to see. It just feels like the only people in this world are the champions of League of Legends, and that shouldn't be the case.
Like it is because they only ever put out content when there's a new champion to promote. Like that's for most of all the lore content that has ever been put out has been because there's a new champion to promote. So we're doing a lore event or we're doing a crossover because we have the Gangplank re-release. So we do a big Bilgewater event, and there is we need to do Halloween skins, so we have the harrowing. Like it's a lot of it's been tied into content releases, and it's like I could talk for a couple of hours on all this shit that Riot could do much better with their lore.
But they have a really bad habit of not naming the supporting characters in all of their stories. Like if the story is not about the champion that's coming out, that character doesn't get a name. And I'm sort of just like, they're people too within
That's
your
not
world.
necessarily
You know?
true, because I mean it is true, right? Like it's more true than it's not. But like they've started to do it. They gave the troll a name in this one. I can't remember that. Right, so they did, and
but that was they gave the troll a name who didn't have a name in Brom's story, as far as I recall. But they have done. There was a character who turned up in the Piltover lore update, Tamara, who was a Noxian spy in Piltover, who got caught by Caitlyn and then released back. She turns up again in the Darius comic that they released recently. So I think they're slowly starting to set up to have like more of an extended character gallery. But like Riot are very much, if they're actually starting to put some real effort into creating a lore for their video game, they are very much in the early stages of it.
Early stages of a 5-6-year-old game.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I have a lot of
like
complaints.
7 or 8 at this point.
Right. Yeah. Well, anything else, fellas, that we want to add about Ornn? I think you're right here, Skyen. About 15 minutes ago, I was going to say the same thing. It's really hard to talk about it when we actually are pleased with what Riot put out. So kudos to Riot and their creative team for making something after over a year that we enjoy. We enjoy so much we can't find too much to talk about. Yeah,
I mean, I can talk about some of the lore connections he has with Norse mythology, but Ornn himself, there's not that much more to say about.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm excited to see what happens when he actually gets on there.
I want to
get my hands on him and see. Like, I think he's going to be a top laner and everything, but I'm excited to still see what goes on. And you know, based on what I saw, it looks like there's enough going on visually that Ornn's going to show up, and you're going to be like, okay, shit, that champion's here. What do I do?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about Ornn is he doesn't have to leave lane to buy. And if you have late game scaling champions, they now have more powerful late game items, just by definition. So I think, I don't know what the hell he's going to do to the meta, if he's even going to do anything. But I think if he starts affecting things, it's going to be in a big way, especially since he's only going to hit competitive with, I think, the next preseason, essentially.
Right. Yeah, he won't hit it till next year, or if there's like any small tournaments in between, which there generally are, but it's not like with the big teams that we would normally watch, right? Like SKT isn't their hands on Ornn and showcase him right away.
Historically, that's left a lot of champions or a lot of those champions have kind of been overlooked for a long while.
Yep.
Like Xerath is the one that stands out to me more than anyone else. Like there are a lot of pros who were low-key saying that they thought release Xerath was really, really good, but because he came out between splits, basically, it's like nobody really committed to learning him because they were all taking a break, and then he just sort of fallen off everyone's radar at the time. Granted, the game's a lot older now, but you know, I wonder if this will mean Ornn doesn't see as much play just because of the timing.
It depends on how easy it is to get power out of his special mechanics, and I think because he gives his entire team like more shit to spend gold on, I think I would say I'm pretty optimistic that he's going to turn up in late game scaling comps kind of early on, assuming he's not completely shit when he's in his release date.
And see, I kind of wonder if he provides almost a bandage for the early game type champions and everything. Well, if they suddenly get an extra 1,000 goals worth of stats or something like that the other team just can't get, do they suddenly close the gap between them and a late game scaling counterpart?
I feel like no, but I mean, it will probably help. I mean, I think you can stave off a late game team probably longer, but I don't know. I don't see.
It's one thing I think about, because everybody's otherwise talking about the late game. I'm like, well, is there an argument on the other side?
I mean, it is the first time we've had a champion who can literally just make more stats available to everyone.
Yeah, normally the supports do that.
Yeah.
Well, we'll leave it at that because we'll talk more about Ornn as we get a chance to play him in the upcoming weeks. I don't know what top laner I'm gonna make play it. Punch. It's not really a Sean type of champion because he's not really selfless enough to walk to a lane and let you buy from him. He's just gonna want to split push all game. So I don't know if any of the T-Force guys are gonna work with it.
Santana might be the guy.
Yeah, he's pretty selfish too. To be fair. Pretty much everyone on the show is selfish.
Santana will play.
I mean, it's just how it is. But all right, you can find Skyen, castercomics.com. You can find him Caster Comics with an X on Patreon as well.
Yep.
There you go. You've been releasing Star Guardian artwork on Patreon.
Oh yes, I'm doing a webcomic about the Star Guardians, which you can also find on the Castro Comics website, and you can support it on the Patreon. Every dollar that goes into the Patreon means I do one more page of the comic. So if you want to see one more page of it, then kick $1 my way. And yeah, go support Trinity Force on Patreon as well, because they support me, and we have this wonderful incestuous circle jerking thing going on that I want to keep going for as long as possible.
That's right. Every month we give Skyen a little bit of money, and then Skyen comes on and bitches about a champion. I don't know who actually wins in this at the end of this, but
me.
It works
Definitely
out.
me.
That's all right. It's the least we can do for as much as you do it for the community as well. So,
Aww.
that is episode 466 of the Trinity Force podcast. Thank you guys for sticking around with us, and we will be back Wednesday. What patch is it? 7.16?
I thought it was like 0.18 or something.
0.17? I don't actually know. I haven't been here for a patch, so I don't remember where we're at in the patch cycle. You should know this, Tom.
I should. I'm really bad at remembering what patch we're actually on. It's 0.17. So the two we jumped around. 7.17.
No, it's 7.16.
The one we jumped around, I should say.
It's 7.16, isn't it?
No, according to Surrender, it's 20. It's 7.17.
Oh, you're right.
They're
August 11,
pretty good
2017, patch 7.
about numbering.
There we go. All right. Yeah, you're right. 7.17 comes out. So, Wednesday. Thank you guys for listening, guys. We'll see you 7.17 on Wednesday. Have a good evening.